The first thing would have to tell this civil rights activist uh, and everyone else out there is simply uh, that my grandfather in 1896, 1897, recently an immigrant in Beaufort, South Carolina, uh, had started off like most Jews, coming into Ellis Island, going to New York. I mean, going from Ellis Island, New York, down the coast. Starts off being a peddler. We're between Charleston and Savannah, and so those are the two of the oldest synagogues in America. Uh, we're right between them, a coastal town. Um, uh, no resort town then. You didn't even meet a stranger. Okay. And uh, so he starts off and then he goes out into the country because there are plenty of merchants and businesses downtown Beaufort, small town of about 5,500 people. Segregation is the law of the land. Racism is the natural order of the day, as it were. Um, now, my grandfather, my grandfather wouldn't have known any better. Spoke broken English. He'd just come over from Tiraj, Russia, where he was escaping pogroms and Cossacks. He left his uh, wife and daughter in Tiraj until he could come to Beaufort and get settled. Uh, so he opens his door and he is taking what he calls his morning constitutional. And he's taking his morning constitutional where he takes a walk and he crosses his railroad tracks where Beaufort's a military town, even back then. And the railroad tracks are from Beaufort, Yamasee to Beaufort, where they would pick up the Marines in Yamasee and bring them to Parris Island in Beaufort. So those railroad tracks, um, he would cross them, and then he would come back and open his store and so forth. He had a black mammy back then who was living with him, what they called a mammy, and she did cleaning and cooking and so forth. And they had rooms and bedrooms and kitchen, and the home was behind the store. She stayed there. So he's taking his morning constitutional, and he comes across, and the way I hear the story, okay, he comes across a an infant on the railroad tracks, black, and he is quote unquote, according to my aunt and several others, swathed in brilliant rags. Now, this is a phrase you wouldn't normally, a Jew would not be using. Okay, swathed in brilliant rags. And so my father takes him back to the store and he takes him to the mammy, and the mammy is going to take care of him, and he adopts him, according to Stanley Farbstein of the Jewish Historical Society in South Carolina. In the archives there, it was probably to give the boy a name. Okay, I don't know, but he takes him and he adopts him. Now he's running the store. The boy's in the store for a year or two, and uh, the black mammy, after a year or two or three, not sure, takes him, moves from the store, moves out farther into the country. Okay, and uh, it's it's pretty wild out there. It's very quiet. It is very violent. Any propriety of anything, no matter how small, even if it was a horse and buggy and some peddling and stuff, whatever it was, you could be shot out there. And things were often miles and miles apart. So, as far as we know, the black mammy took the baby and moved way, way out in the country somewhere. All right. And uh, and I don't know if even my grandfather uh, uh, they were in contact with each other. Have no idea. All right. Remember too that this is in the country, so it's not as if you were in downtown Beaufort or in Beaufort proper, and you have adopted a black child in that neighborhood. And uh, so to my grandfather, adopting this black baby was absolutely would have been colorblind. He wouldn't have been worried one bit about racism and white racism and the segregation. He wouldn't have been worried about that. His closest neighbor was a black man, very gentle man, who I later knew, named Reverend Myers, who figures more prominently into this whole story later. They were friends. They were close friends. Um, the question, probably nobody in Beaufort even knew he'd adopted the black child, for all I know, for all we know. Um, uh, so he would have been thinking about that. His nightmares would have been about pogroms, would have been about Cossacks. It would have been about, I know one of the traumas he had was uh, crossing the border to get onto a boat that would take him to Ellis Island. And how was he going to get across that border? And of course, he was in his horse and buggy. He filled up the horse and buggy with vodka, and he went to the uh, coast checkpoint, the border, got all of the soldiers there drunk. When they were all passed out, he waited hours. He just crossed the border. All right, that's the way they did it back then. But that must have been pretty fearful for him. All right, he's got this on his mind. He's not got race relations in the United States. He doesn't have on his mind, my gosh, the state he's in now is the first state to ever secede from the Union and commit treason against the United States. All right. So what happens is, it's about 3 or 4 years later, in 1900, my father doesn't know whether he was born on the boat from Ellis Island, on the way down from Ellis Island, in Beaufort itself. The country was a good 7 miles out from Beaufort. And remember, horse and buggy days. Okay, people weren't in contact. All right, and uh, the my father later on uh, would ride his horse and buggy 7 miles, a mule named Blackie, to school in Beaufort, elementary school, the same one I went to, the same one my brothers went to. And he would park the horse and buggy, the mule and buggy, in the same place where a bike rack was later installed to handle our bikes, the students' bikes at the school. Okay. So I know the whole area is still geographically so stable. And uh, so what happens is my father, his older sister, later his younger sister, my mother, and my grandfather lived in the rooms behind the store. The black mammy is gone, the adopted child is gone. My father grew up in that store, and he was always told by my grandfather, this was a big deal. Son, do not leave the cash drawer open. Do not leave that cash drawer open. It attracts thieves. It attracts violence, which it did. Okay. So one night, about 9 o'clock in the evening, uh, my father apparently had left, my grandfather, excuse me, my grandfather had apparently left that cash drawer open. The store is actually locked. He's forgotten he's done it. My father hears the shots from the back room in his store. He runs out. Uh, he runs out of the room. He passes my grandmother in the back door to the store, and she says, in his words, she is frozen and glass-eyed. A look that would remain on her face for the rest of her life. She would become what he called an emotional invalid. These are all his words now, and this is all his story now, if you will. Um, uh, uh, so he sees the assassin. It's a black man of about 20 with a gun in his hand. Apparently, according to him later, The door was locked, and my grandfather opened it because he thought the man wanted a pack of cigarettes. All right. We have no idea if he even knew who the man was. All right. But the cash drawer was open. So my grandfather and the black assassin who murders him, okay, is they're locked in an embrace. And my grandfather is holding the man's gun hand in his other hand down by his side so he can't lift the gun and shoot my father as he was 15, 16, as he races across the counter to grab that gun hand. All right. Now, um, and then by the time my father grabs hold of that gun hand, my grandfather has just slipped, fallen carelessly to the store, to the against the counter. He's dead. He's passed away. Now, it's a struggle that goes on between the 16-year-old father, my father, and the assassin. And it's bad. Shots are fired, flour sacks, flour sifting out of them, cans exploding, fruit exploding, apples. The gun hand is going back and forth until my father, and I'll explain how he could do this later. My father turns the gun hand so that the assassin is looking into the barrel of the gun, at which time the assassin flees, plunges through the storefront window into the night. My father later would talk about this. He would awaken at night later with the feel of a pistol in his hand. Now, I also need to jump ahead, if I can, into the future a little bit, uh, uh, and explain how a small, wiry man like this could have taken that gun and done what he did with it. His grip was unbelievable. And when I was a child and my brothers were kids, he he would go into Beaufort now, where he has taken his family and moves into a new store to escape the violence out there. My father quit school at the age of 16 and runs the store and takes care of the family and so forth. Now, back then, often there were drunken Marines. It was a military town, usually white people. Okay. Most of his customers were black. It was in a poor slum section of town, corner grocery store. But the Marines would be there too. And they were usually either white poor people or Marines who drank a lot. And and so if one of them got unruly, we would see my father simply grin and offer to shake his hand. And the guy would be hopping and squealing all the way out the store. No harm done. My father grinning. And so he was a man, a gentleman who dismissed drunks from his store with a handshake. Okay? If he wanted to discipline us kids, all he did was offer his hand. And we knew to stand straight and tall and take responsibility. All right. And so this is much later. We're in Beaufort and he's established. Now, I want to explain that grip. He probably got it from unloading and loading merchandise in his father's country store. So now let's go back to that country store. Okay. We're back in the woods, 7 miles outside of Beaufort. Nobody knows what's going on. My father's standing there with a gun in his hand. My grandmother is frozen and glass-eyed in the doorway. Uh, his older sister and younger is probably asleep in the back room. Who knows where they are? All right. Um, and uh, I told you that my father's closest friend back then was Reverend Myers, just the gentlest man and nicest man. And remember, people live far apart, so they were close enough to be intimates. And Reverend Myers came over right away. All right, the sheriff is there right away. Uh, A few of his deputies are there right away. The sheriff asks for a description of the man. Now, what my father noticed, and this is the only thing he noticed, is he said, Reverend Myers clearly was stunned. He knew who the man was. He was absolutely flabbergasted, just stricken. And he knew who the man was from my father's description. So he and the sheriff and the deputies are going to go out and find him and try to find him 20 miles away, whatever, in the woods somewhere. Now, in the meantime, and this is the second thing, Bruce, that is certainly revelatory and important and surprised our civil rights activists, and I think will surprise our viewers. A lynch mob was formed. And this is how different it was in the South than what you would expect. They dispersed. You know why? They could not find a black man. I'm sorry. A lynch mob formed. They dispersed. They could not find a white man to lead them. Now, I'll repeat that. I have to. I've told this story before on book tours and so forth. And I can tell you, I always have to repeat it. Nobody gets it. It takes 3 times for them, the audience, most of the audience, to realize that it's a black lynch mob. So they needed the force of law, I guess. They needed a white man to lead them. They were going after this black assassin who had murdered their neighbor in the woods, blah, blah, blah. All right. And they dispersed because they can't find a white man to lead them. That's number 2, okay, of the things people would not know about the South. All right. The sheriff and a few deputies, I think, and Reverend Myers. Reverend Myers leads them way, way out into the woods. They find him, the murderer, in an old backwoods shack, okay? He is hidden between the mattress and the bed springs in a back room. They bring him in. He is tried. Now, he is convicted. My father testifies at the trial. Reverend Myers testifies. There were people in town. And remember, this is not the country now. We're in Beaufort proper, in town, who certainly wanted to lynch him, okay? Wanted something horrible to happen to him. And my father told them, but it was a black man who found the assassin. It was a black man who brought him to justice. And so they tried him. They convicted him. Now, at that time, there was an electric chair, and it circulated the state like a circuit preacher would have done back then, okay? And so it was time to come to Beaufort. They came to Beaufort, and the man was electrocuted. He was killed. But he was tried by a jury, and he was killed. Now, I want us to now realize we have this 16-year-old kid, okay? He's back in the country now, all right? And we're back in the country. He moves his family eventually, as soon as he can, to Beaufort proper. He wants to escape the violence, escape the stuff out there, the dangers, and so forth. He's got enough money. He moves the store and reopens and builds a store in Beaufort proper, in the slums, okay? Now, I want to emphasize this. His business were mostly black people, few white people, mostly poor, and a few Marines. His regulars, of course, were mostly black. They paid when they could. And his answer to anything criticism from Mom was basically, well, hey, we're making more than we're losing. All right. And he ran the store, and people would come in, and Reverend Myers would be in there. Reverend Myers then was married, had a family, the whole thing, probably a decade younger than my grandfather and a decade older or so than my father. And my father, Reverend Myers, moved his family a few blocks in the slums where the store was, right on the border. When my father moved into town, he moved his family into town. So every Saturday morning, uh, uh, I would work for Daddy in the store Mom made me. Okay, for 50 cents an hour, that gets you, let's face it, a Coke downtown, popcorn, a comic book, and a Western at the movies, right? So it was plenty of money, but I was pretty greedy. All right. So Daddy realized I was really lazy. Finally, one day, he just looked at me, Bruce. He held out his hand and he said, "Son, we're partners in crime. Don't tell your mother, but you do make me laugh and you're entertaining as hell. Okay? You got a good personality." He said, "Now, son, I don't want to make you feel like personality is all you got to have to get by in life. You're going to need to work. You're going to need to do a little work." Okay? He worried about that. But still, he accepted the way it was. So every Saturday morning, we would load up and fill up his car. I think it was an old Buick then, with, I mean, tons, it seemed like, of merchandise. I mean, everything from cleaning materials, and mops and brooms and food, cans of food, meats, vegetables, fruit. And the trunk in the back seat would be filled up. And we would drive over to Reverend Myers' little place, a few blocks down the store. Reverend Myers would greet us. Now, Reverend Myers, as I said, this is poverty that is incredible. Okay. The yard is a dirt yard that's swept. Sometimes the dirt and the wind will make moats in there. He had two kids with polio. It was polio season. And you could see them dragging themselves, their braces, across the porch. Um, he was married, and he would come out on the porch. Two kids would be there. And Daddy would get out of the car and he'd stand by the car and he would say to Reverend Myers something which baffled me as a kid, 9-year-old kid. "Reverend, it's good to see you. It's a great world if it don't weaken. What do you think?" And Reverend Myers would say, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." And "Good to see you. Good to see your boy." And we would then take all the goods and put them on his front porch. Now, of course, I wanted to go in. All I could see was the linoleum peeling up. It's almost a tar paper shack. It's precariously perched on concrete blocks. Okay, it is pure poverty. All right. Reverend Myers, always in a suit. And and I can tell you too, of all the people in the store, the person who gave this little 5-year-old boy a nickel every Saturday when he came in was Reverend Myers. That was the kind, and uh, so we would tack it up on there. And of course, I didn't know then why we couldn't go in. And of course, it was because Reverend Myers was poor. He knew where we lived. Poor people, all, in these small town like Beaufort, knew where white middle class, lower middle class people lived. And they were shamed, I'm sure, of where they lived. Not all of them by any means, and few, some of them were middle class, but certainly with that kind of poverty, we weren't invited in. Okay, Daddy just took it for granted. All right, so we would then put the goods on the porch, and as we stacked them up, Reverend Myers would uh, would take them into the house, and they would chat while they were doing it, like old friends. And then we get ready to leave, and Daddy would say to the Reverend standing in front of the car and the Reverend on his porch across the yard, they would say their goodbyes. And Daddy couldn't help it. He'd say, "Reverend, how's the world treating you? How's the world treating you?" And Reverend Myers would always answer in the same way. "We'll manage, Mr. Schein. We'll manage." I had no idea. what that meant. Of course, Dad did. And on the way home, I have to confess, as a 9-year-old boy, I know that Reverend Myers is not paying for any of this. I know that Reverend Myers is one of the poorest of all the regulars. And Daddy had a little notebook he had on his desk, and he'd check off when his regulars were paid. They were no checks by Reverend Myers' name. So I looked down there and I said, Daddy, I think I need a raise. And I think if you start charging Reverend Myers for some of this food, I think I'll be in better standings financially. Well, I think Dad was probably so amused by it, he probably didn't say anything. This is the third thing I wanted to tell you. My Jewish grandfather, an immigrant, speaking broken English, adopted a black child, whatever that means. A lynch mob was formed to go after the murderer, who was a black man, and they dispersed because they couldn't find a white man to lead them. A black lynch mob going after a black murderer. That was the intimacy in the Low Country of that day out in the country. The killer was the black child who he had adopted. And that's my story. And I think it's a story that shows when you take in Beaufort in the country, Beaufort proper, back in the town, and all that happened there. Look at the intimacy that was out there that was innocent. And so I say to this person who I respected very much, he'd done a lot of great civil rights work. And I say, these are the three things, despite the Orangeburg massacre, and despite all you did that was good in the South, for which we're all grateful. These are the three things you don't know about the South. And there are always things you're not going to know about the South or anybody else. It's why we do this podcast, Bruce.